Kia ora. In this presentation, I will discuss the influence of my worldview, the significance of Te Tiriti or Waitangi, and the need for cultural intelligence in social work practice. I share as someone who has grappled with the complexities of my cultural positioning of colonisation and the issue of historical amnesia. Through this journey, I've deepened my understanding of my relationship with Te Tiriti-informed practice. Prominent academic Ani Mikari defines worldview as a theoretical framework embodying a philosophy of life that was both reflected in and reflective of the social norms and practices of our tupuna. It determines the ways in which we relate to one another. It enables us to explain how we came to be here and where we are going. It forms the very core of our identity. To begin, I'd like to share a whakatauki which captures the essence of my kōrero. I ngā kei te mōhio koe ko wai koe, I anga mai koe I hia. Kei te mōhio koe kei te anga atu ki hia. If you know who you are and where you are from, you will know where you are going. This whakatauki captures the idea that our history informs our identity. During my time at BTI, I've been invited to reflect on the influences that have formed my worldview and made me the person I am today. This mahi is based on the concept that the personal and professional cannot be separated. Knowing who I am and where I come from is essential to knowing where I'm going within my social work practice. In my personal experience, growing up as a pastor's kid and attending a Christian school, I lived a very sheltered life. It was at the age of 12 when we moved cities and I began attending a mainstream school that I realised Christian values were not the norm. The social pressure to conform led me to abandon my faith during my remaining school years, and because of this formative experience, I have empathy for others who have had their beliefs diminished. Today, the biblical mandate to uphold the cause of the oppressed makes a significant contribution to my belief system. Although I had this experience of being a minority, I'm a member of the dominant culture in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My ethnicity, sexual orientation, and economic positioning are all examples of how I fit into the cultural norms. In her master's thesis, Linda highlighted that one of the privileges of being a member of the dominant culture is that your views are considered normal and therefore require no explanation. I've noticed there is also something deeper at play. Historical amnesia, which I'll discuss later in this presentation, has hindered the ability of Pākehā to know who we are and how we belong. Mikaere posits that there is little wonder that Pākehā New Zealand struggles with the question of identity, seeking to create cultural icons of gumboots, black singlets, pavlova, kiwi fruit and the buzzy bee toy. This quote emphasises to me our immaturity as a people group. Okay, moving on to the structural factors. The Western ideologies that govern the economic, educational and political systems in Aotearoa, New Zealand have certainly contributed to my view of the world. The colonial habit to dictate how things will be done sends a message that one way is superior to any other. Mikaere labels the current legal system an imposter system due to its stark difference to the system which existed prior to colonisation. She highlights how the dominance of the British legal system is linked to racism, an idea echoed by Ruka, who sees colonisation as inherently racist. Ruka articulates his point by stating that if you take over the lands and power of a people and you replace them with your own institutions, that is an act of racism. And so racism is not just a personal attribute of considering yourself better than or superior to others. It is a system of denying the full humanity of others. It is a structural, ideological system, and colonisation is part of that ideological system. Reflecting on my own views, I realise I've unknowingly upheld the racist notion of Western superiority through my uncritical participation in these systems of oppression. However, recognising the harmful impact of colonisation has shifted my worldview. I now see the importance of challenging and changing dominant structures to promote equality and justice. The ability to work at relational depth depends on the social worker's level of self-awareness, which is why it's imperative that we take the time to understand our own heritage, worldview, and positioning. From a micro perspective, Adamczyk discusses the impact of self-awareness and the quality of the relationship between social work practitioners and tangata whaiora. She suggests that working at relational depth is one of the pillars of effective practice within a person-centred approach. It's defined by high levels of empathy, acceptance, and transparency, and the literature suggests that this posture has a substantial positive effect on the outcomes of intervention. Essentially, because the use of self is an integral part of relationship-based practice, those practitioners who possess and actively develop an awareness of their heritage worldview and positioning provide more effective services. This is because when tangata whaora experience the social worker as someone who brings their true self to their mahi, it offers an invitation to be tika and pono themselves. Furthermore, locating ourselves assists us to identify the ways in which we uphold a biased view of the world, and therefore increases our ability to dismantle oppressive mindsets within ourselves. Pākehā social workers need to reflect on how we have contributed to the colonisation process and consider our role as agents of change. Whether we are conscious of this fact or not, colonisation has shaped the landscape of Aotearoa New Zealand, and dismantling its effects will require a contribution from all people who call this land home. During my upbringing, the place of he whakapūtanga and te tiriti o Waitangi were not once discussed either at home or school. The Treaty of Waitangi was acknowledged on Waitangi Day with a public holiday that had a vague connection to the foundation of New Zealand. This created in me an assumption that our history is not relevant to my life. For most of my life, even the observance of Waitangi Day was not linked to the formative treaty which enables my right to existence in this land. This speaks to the historical amnesia prevalent among many colonising people groups. This disregard for the past has been identified as a strategy designed to help the oppressor deal with the uncomfortable reality of the injustices inflicted by our ancestors and perpetuated by us. Mikaidi states that to forget history is to allow myths to spring up in its place, myths which serve to ease the conscience of those upon whom history does not reflect well. I'm very aware of the evidence that historical amnesia is part of the colonial condition, and therefore I'm making a significant effort to learn the true history of Aotearoa New Zealand. I'm in the early stages of working out what my obligations and contribution as an ally to tangata whenua will look like. Regarding the role of the coloniser, Paulo Freire has argued that the oppressor is unable to lead this struggle, but in discovering himself to be an oppressor, must necessarily seek true solidarity with the oppressed, by fighting at their side to transform the objective reality. On my journey of confronting the harmful impact of colonisation, I've made a commitment to supporting spaces where tikanga Māori is upheld. I also feel a responsibility to encourage other Pākehā to realise their role and responsibility within te tiriti. Regarding my cultural ethnicity, for as long as I can remember, I've struggled to accept the label European, preferring to use Pākehā, as that is at least a representation of my geographical identity. There is nowhere else in the world that one can be Pākehā. I've recently learnt that my father's ancestors immigrated to this land from Scotland. Having had very little interaction with my grandparents, or any relatives older than my parents, I feel no connection to these ancestors, who I call my fathers rather than my own. Returning to what does resonate, Pākehā is a word which was used initially by tangata whenua to describe the white inhabitants of Aotearoa. That description continues to resonate with me, yet over the last 5 or so years my views on my heritage have expanded through education around te tiriti o Waitangi. Sir Edward Dury is associated with coining the term tangata tiriti, meaning those who belong to this land by right of te tiriti o Waitangi. Without te tiriti, non-Māori have no lawful standing in Aotearoa New Zealand. Te tiriti o Waitangi is an agreement not only for Māori, but for all people who call this land home. By using the label tangata tiriti, I acknowledge the cultural history of the country I call home. Dr. Alistair Rees highlights that te tiriti is a covenantal relationship between two groups, tangata whenua and tangata tiriti. Therefore, the term tangata tiriti should be used by anyone who is non-Māori and who live in this land through the provisions of te tiriti. When we as non-Māori self-identify as tangata tiriti, we're acknowledging our rights and responsibilities in relation to tiriti and our tiriti partners. We have a right to stand here and a responsibility to know the covenant we are a part of. As mentioned, I've not always had this understanding of my position as a tiriti partner. In his kōrero titled Transforming Lives by Exploring Histories, Rawiri Waritini Karina uses music to illustrate how his thoughts and behaviours have changed over time. This resonated with me and enabled me to identify that only a few years ago the term tangata tiriti had never crossed my radar. Yet today it is of profound significance to my identity and consequently my engagement with Te Tiriti informed practice. Cultural competency is a professional obligation for social workers in Aotearoa, New Zealand. However, social work organisations have tended to frame their understanding of cultural competency as the acquisition of cultural knowledge, rather than the reflective self-assessment of power, privilege and biases. To become a Te Tiriti informed, culturally respectful social worker requires introspection into my own cultural background and the ways it shapes my worldview. This self-reflection helps me recognise the inherent biases that perpetuate inequality and oppression. Becoming competent in the cultures of others does nothing towards shifting harmful narratives, but developing cultural intelligence has the potential to move me beyond mere cultural competency. I recognise that biculturalism, as Sullivan defines it, entails an equal partnership that values and supports cultural diversity. I believe that Aotearoa New Zealand is transitioning from a history of dominance towards a future of diversity, and my role is to actively contribute to this journey by developing my cultural intelligence and working for equity and justice when my self-reflection reveals biases within myself that are oppressive. The invitation this assignment has given me to reflect on my own cultural positioning and engagement with Te Tiriti o Waitangi has been both encouraging and transformative. It has reminded me that honouring Te Tiriti and working towards a future of genuine partnership requires me to engage in reflective self-assessment. From a place of self-awareness, I can recognise the power dynamics and biases in my own worldview and how they affect my practice. This critical work will allow me to practice in a way that is anti-oppressive. As someone who cares so deeply about justice, it can be easier to look forward than to look back. I've acknowledged how historical amnesia, which is prevalent among colonising groups, has played a role in my story. Learning the true history of Aotearoa New Zealand has helped me understand my obligations as tangata tiriti. I embrace the label tangata tiriti as I strive to become an ally to tangata whenua. This assignment has also affirmed that it is imperative that we as social workers take the time to understand our own heritage, worldview and positioning so that we can be authentic in our relationships with tangata whaiora. By expanding our understanding of ourselves, we're able to foster relationships which are more likely to facilitate genuine engagement and therefore positive outcomes. I recognise the privilege inherent in being a member of the dominant culture in Aotearoa New Zealand. I've also considered the structural inequalities perpetuated by Western ideologies, particularly those rooted in colonialism and racism. This piece of work has reinforced my commitment to challenging and dismantling oppression, both personally and professionally. Furthermore, I recognise the importance of cultural intelligence in social work practice. Moving beyond mere cultural competency towards a deeper understanding of power, privilege and bias is essential. I hope to play a meaningful role in Aotearoa New Zealand's transition towards a future that values and supports biculturalism. Knowing who I am and where I come from is essential to knowing where I'm going with my social work practice. As I continue on this path, I'm dedicated to challenging oppressive structures, amplifying marginalised voices, and contributing to a more equitable future for Aotearoa New Zealand. I want to acknowledge all of the sources which have informed my learning and who have played an active role in this struggle for justice. In particular, I'd like to thank Jay Ruka, Linda Coley, and Alistair Rees for their contributions in this space of biculturalism. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Kia ora.